"Don't embarrass us in front of the guests." Those were the first words my daughter-in-law whispered to me at my grandson Ethan's 7th birthday party, and I remember standing there with a wrapped present in my hands, wondering how a simple afternoon celebration had already turned into something that made my chest feel strangely heavy. The party was held in Daniel and Jessica's suburban home just outside Columbus, the kind of neighborhood with wide driveways, trimmed lawns, and colorful balloons tied to every mailbox whenever someone celebrated a birthday. I had spent the entire morning getting ready, baking a small batch of chocolate chip cookies the way Ethan liked them and wrapping the gift I had picked out weeks earlier. A classic wooden train set I had seen in a little toy store downtown. It reminded me of the toys Daniel used to love when he was a boy, back when Saturdays meant pancakes in the kitchen and afternoons building tracks across the living room floor. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, there were already more than a dozen cars parked along the curb, and children's laughter drifted through the open backyard gate. Bright blue balloons shaped like the number 7 bobbed in the summer breeze, and someone had set up a long folding table covered in paper plates and cupcakes decorated with green frosting. It looked like the kind of birthday party any grandmother would be happy to see, the kind that fills photo albums and family memories. I remember adjusting the strap of my purse and smoothing my cardigan before walking toward the backyard, telling myself how proud I was of Daniel for building this life. He had worked hard, bought this house 5 years earlier, and now he had a son who ran through the yard with a plastic sword and a superhero cape flapping behind him. But the moment I stepped through the gate, I felt something small but noticeable shift in the air. Jessica was standing near the patio arranging gift bags, greeting guests with a bright smile that seemed carefully practiced, and when her eyes landed on me, that smile didn't quite disappear, but it didn't warm either. She walked toward me slowly, her heels clicking on the stone patio, and for a second I thought she might offer a hug or at least a polite hello. Instead she leaned in slightly, just enough that no one else could hear, and that was when she said it, quietly but firmly, "Don't embarrass us in front of the guests." For a moment I wasn't even sure I had heard her correctly. I hadn't said a word yet. I was still holding Ethan's birthday present, still smiling like any grandmother arriving at a party. Around us the yard buzzed with conversation and children racing past with balloons, but inside my head everything went oddly quiet. I looked at Jessica, hoping maybe she would laugh and say she was joking, but she had already turned away, calling to someone about the cake table like the conversation had never happened. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I probably should have, watching Ethan run across the grass with 3 other boys chasing him, his laugh carrying through the warm afternoon air. And in that moment, I realized something that made the party feel very different from the one I thought I had come to attend. Somehow, somewhere along the way, I had become the person Jessica believed might embarrass her, and I had absolutely no idea why. For the next several minutes I simply stood near the edge of the yard, holding the gift bag and watching the party unfold around me, as if I had accidentally stepped into someone else's family gathering instead of my own grandson's birthday. Children ran across the grass chasing bubbles that floated from a small machine humming near the fence. Parents gathered in small circles talking about work, school schedules, and summer vacations, and the smell of grilled hot dogs drifted from the patio where Daniel was standing beside the barbecue. I spotted him laughing with 2 neighbors, flipping burgers with the same relaxed confidence he had developed over the years, and for a moment I considered walking over to say hello. But something about the quiet warning Jessica had given me still echoed in my mind, making my steps hesitate. I had spent most of my life raising Daniel to be kind and thoughtful, and it felt strange to suddenly feel like a guest who needed to behave carefully in her own family. Eventually Ethan noticed me first. He ran toward me with grass stains on his sneakers and a bright smile that reminded me so much of Daniel when he was that age. He wrapped his arms around my waist and shouted, "Grandma, you came." I laughed and hugged him back, handing him the gift bag while telling him he had to wait until later to open it like all the others. His excitement was genuine and uncomplicated, the kind of joy only a 7-year-old can carry without effort, and for a moment the uneasy feeling faded. Jessica quickly appeared beside us, her voice cheerful but slightly rushed as she guided Ethan back toward the other children. She thanked me for the gift in a polite tone, the kind people use with distant relatives, then turned her attention to the next arriving guests. I found an empty chair near one of the folding tables and sat down, noticing that most of the family members were gathered closer to the patio while I seemed to be positioned near a group of people I did not recognize. A woman sitting beside me introduced herself as Melissa and explained that she worked with Jessica at a marketing company downtown. We spoke politely about the weather and the neighborhood while watching the children play a game organized by a young college student Jessica had hired to entertain them. From across the yard, I saw Daniel glance in my direction once or twice, offering a small wave before returning to his conversation. It was not unfriendly, but it was distant in a way that made me wonder when exactly that distance had grown between us. As the afternoon continued, Jessica moved around the yard greeting people, arranging trays of food, and directing the flow of the party like someone hosting an event that needed to look perfect in every photograph. Several guests took pictures with their phones, capturing the decorations and the cake table covered with bright superhero designs. Watching it all from my chair, I began to realize that the celebration felt less like a simple family birthday and more like a carefully arranged scene where every detail had been planned. And the more I observed, the more I sensed that my place in that scene had been quietly moved somewhere along the edge. From where I was sitting, it became easier to observe the rhythm of the party, and the longer I watched, the more small details began to stand out in ways I could not ignore. Jessica moved confidently from one group of guests to another, greeting people with warm enthusiasm, introducing Daniel to coworkers, and making sure every plate was full and every child had something to drink. She had clearly put a great deal of effort into making the afternoon look perfect, the kind of celebration people would remember as cheerful and well organized. Yet every time she passed by the table where I was sitting, she seemed to look right through me as if I were simply another neighbor who had wandered in. It was not rude in an obvious way. In fact, anyone watching from a distance might have thought everything was completely normal. But sometimes silence can say more than words. I noticed that the family photos being taken near the balloon arch included Daniel, Jessica, and Ethan standing together while several guests gathered around them smiling for pictures. A few times someone suggested taking another photo, adjusting positions, laughing when the children made funny faces. I waited, expecting that eventually someone would call me over, perhaps Daniel waving his hand and saying, "Mom, come join us." But the invitation never came. Instead, I remained at the table while the camera flashes continued across the yard. Melissa, the woman sitting beside me, seemed to notice the same thing. She glanced toward the photo area and then back at me with a polite but slightly uncertain smile, as though she sensed something she did not quite understand. She asked how long I had lived in the area, and when I explained that Daniel had grown up only 20 minutes from here, she looked surprised and said she had assumed Jessica's family lived nearby because she often talked about relatives visiting. That comment lingered in my thoughts. Over the years, I had tried to be supportive whenever Daniel and Jessica needed help. When they first bought this house, I spent 2 weekends helping them paint the spare bedroom and assemble furniture. When Ethan was born, I drove over nearly every Sunday bringing homemade soup and casseroles, so they could rest during those exhausting first months of parenthood. None of it felt like a sacrifice. It simply felt like what families do for one another. Yet sitting there that afternoon, listening to the conversations around me, I began to realize that many of the people at this party probably had no idea who I was. From their perspective, I was simply an older woman quietly observing from the corner table while the real celebration happened closer to the patio. The realization was not loud or dramatic. It arrived slowly, like the gentle awareness that a room has grown colder. And as the afternoon sun shifted across the yard and the laughter of children echoed near the fence, I started to understand that Jessica had not only planned this party carefully, she had also carefully decided exactly where I belonged within it. The longer I remained at that table, the clearer the invisible line in the yard began to feel, as if the celebration had quietly divided itself into 2 different spaces. Near the patio, laughter rose easily as Daniel handed out drinks and Jessica moved confidently between guests, her voice cheerful and welcoming. Out near the folding tables where I sat, the conversations were softer and mostly between people who seemed to be meeting one another for the first time. I watched as Jessica clapped her hands lightly to gather everyone's attention, announcing that it was time for the children to play another game before the cake. The entertainer led the group of kids toward the center of the lawn, and Ethan ran past me again, his cape trailing behind him like a small red flag in the summer breeze. He stopped just long enough to give me a quick smile before joining the others. That simple moment warmed me more than anything else that afternoon, because with children there is never any pretending. If they are happy to see you, it shows instantly. As the game began, several parents stood nearby with their phones raised, recording the scene while the children laughed and tried to follow the instructions. Jessica stood among them, adjusting decorations and offering encouragement to the kids, while occasionally glancing toward the camera lenses that followed every moment. Daniel remained by the grill for a while before finally stepping away and joining the group closer to the house. I noticed that when people approached him, he seemed relaxed but slightly distracted, as if his attention was constantly pulled between conversations and whatever Jessica was organizing next. A few minutes later, someone brought out a tray of lemonade and paper cups, placing them on the table near me. I poured myself a small drink and listened to two guests nearby discussing how beautiful the house was and how talented Jessica must be to host such a polished event. Their compliments were sincere, and I could not deny that the party did look impressive. Yet while they spoke, one of them asked casually whether Jessica's parents were planning to arrive later. The other woman shrugged and said she had not heard anything about them. Neither of them looked in my direction, and it occurred to me that they probably assumed I was simply another guest from the neighborhood. I wondered briefly what they would think if they knew that the boy blowing bubbles across the lawn was my grandson, and that the man laughing beside the patio was the child I had raised for nearly 2 decades. The thought was not bitter exactly, but it carried a quiet sadness that settled deeper the longer I sat there. Eventually Jessica walked past my table again, checking her phone as if reviewing a schedule only she could see. She glanced at me for a brief moment and gave a small polite nod before continuing toward the patio where Daniel was standing. It was the same kind of nod people exchange with strangers in a grocery store aisle, friendly but distant, and it confirmed something I had begun to understand during the past hour. This party had been carefully arranged to create a certain image, a perfect afternoon where everything appeared effortless and joyful. And somewhere within that image, my role had been reduced to something small enough that most people would never notice it at all. As the afternoon moved forward, the sun began to settle a little lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn while the children continued running in circles near the fence. The entertainer finally announced that it was time for cake, and immediately the energy of the party shifted as parents called their kids back toward the patio. Ethan ran past me again with the same excited grin, his sneakers thumping against the grass while he hurried toward the table where the cake had been placed. From my seat I could see it clearly now. A large cake decorated with bright green frosting and a superhero figure standing proudly on top. Jessica stepped forward again, clapping her hands lightly to gather everyone closer while Daniel carried out a tray of small paper plates and plastic forks. Guests began forming a semicircle around the table, raising their phones again. As the children crowded near Ethan, I watched the group gather, noticing how naturally everyone moved toward that center space while my chair remained a little farther away. For a moment I considered standing up and walking over to join them, but something about the earlier whisper still lingered in my mind, holding me back. I did not want to create the kind of moment Jessica seemed so worried about. Instead I stayed where I was, sipping the last of my lemonade and observing the scene from a distance. The candles were placed on the cake and someone handed Daniel a lighter. When the small flames flickered to life, the group began singing the familiar birthday song, their voices blending together in cheerful harmony. I could see Ethan's face glowing with excitement as he leaned forward, ready to make his wish. And as the song continued, I suddenly realized something that made the moment feel strangely hollow. In all the photographs being taken, in all the smiling faces gathered around that cake, there was no space where I had been invited to stand. It was a small detail, but it spoke loudly. When Ethan blew out the candles, everyone cheered and clapped while the entertainer started organizing the children into a line for cake. Jessica quickly took charge again, handing plates to guests and thanking people for coming as if she were hosting a formal event rather than a simple family gathering. A few minutes later, Ethan began opening gifts, sitting on a small chair while Jessica placed each brightly wrapped package beside him. I recognized several presents from friends and neighbors, colorful boxes filled with toys and games. Eventually the gift bag I had brought was added to the pile. Ethan spotted it almost immediately and reached for it with curiosity. Jessica hesitated for a brief moment before passing it to him, her smile still carefully in place while several guests continued filming with their phones. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, watching as Ethan pulled away the tissue paper and lifted the wooden train set from the box. His eyes widened with genuine delight, and he held it up proudly so everyone could see. For the first time that afternoon, a few people turned in my direction, perhaps wondering who had chosen that gift. And in that quiet moment, while Ethan admired the polished wooden tracks and little red engine, I noticed Daniel looking from the toy in his son's hands back toward me with an expression that seemed thoughtful, as if something about that simple gift had reminded him of a memory he had almost forgotten. Daniel continued watching Ethan hold the wooden train set in his hands, and for a moment something in his expression softened in a way I had not seen all afternoon. Ethan turned the small red engine over carefully, studying the wheels and the smooth wooden tracks like a treasure he had not expected. Children around him leaned closer, curious about the toy, and one of the parents nearby commented that it looked beautifully made. Ethan looked up at his father and said excitedly that it was the best train he had ever seen. Jessica gave a polite smile and said that it was a very classic toy, though her voice carried the same careful tone she had used with me earlier. But Daniel did not respond right away. Instead, he kept looking at the train set with the thoughtful gaze of someone remembering something from long ago. I recognized that look immediately because I had seen it many times when Daniel was a boy. When he was 6 years old, he had received a train set almost exactly like that one for Christmas. We had spent hours on the living room floor building tracks that stretched across the carpet while snow fell outside the windows. I remembered how Daniel used to push the little engine around the track again and again, making quiet train sounds under his breath while I sat beside him with a cup of coffee and watched him play. Those afternoons had been simple and warm, the kind of memories that stay with a parent long after a child grows up. Eventually Daniel cleared his throat and asked Ethan where the gift had come from. Ethan immediately pointed across the yard toward me and said happily that Grandma brought it. Several guests followed the direction of his finger and glanced over at my table. For the first time since I arrived that afternoon, I felt the quiet attention of the room shift slightly in my direction. Daniel looked at me again, this time with a faint smile that carried a hint of surprise. He told Ethan that when he was a boy he had a train set, very similar to that one, and that he used to build tracks all across the house. Ethan's eyes widened with excitement as he asked if they could set it up later. Daniel nodded and said they certainly could. Jessica remained beside the gift table, still smiling for the guests, but I noticed the small pause in her movements as she watched the exchange. It was only a second, barely noticeable unless someone was paying close attention. The children soon returned to opening more presents and the noise of the party continued. But something subtle had shifted. Daniel walked a few steps away from the patio and looked across the yard again, this time more directly. Our eyes met for a brief moment and he gave a small nod, the kind that carries more meaning than a long conversation. I returned the gesture with a quiet smile before looking back at Ethan and the other children gathered around him. The celebration carried on with laughter and chatter, yet beneath the cheerful sounds I sensed a new awareness forming, as if one small memory had reminded Daniel of a part of the story that had not been included in the picture everyone else was seeing. The party slowly settled into a calmer rhythm after the excitement of opening gifts, and children began drifting back toward the lawn to play with their new toys, while the adults returned to quiet conversations around the tables. Ethan, however, stayed close to the patio, kneeling on the ground with the wooden train set beside him as he carefully examined each piece. Daniel eventually walked over and crouched beside his son, picking up one of the tracks and turning it thoughtfully in his hands. From where I was sitting I could see them speaking quietly, though I could not hear the words. Ethan pointed toward the small red engine again and Daniel nodded slowly, as if explaining something from his own childhood. The moment felt gentle and sincere, the kind of quiet connection between a father and his son that no party decorations could create. Jessica approached them a moment later, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear while glancing toward several guests who were still chatting nearby. She said something to Daniel that I could not hear, but I noticed the way Daniel looked back toward me once again before answering her. His expression was not confrontational, simply thoughtful, like someone piecing together details that had previously gone unnoticed. Ethan soon ran off with 2 other boys to test the train on a small patch of sidewalk near the fence, leaving Daniel standing alone beside the patio table. For a brief moment he remained there watching his son, and then he walked slowly across the yard in my direction. I straightened slightly in my chair when I saw him approaching, unsure what he intended to say but grateful for the chance to speak with him at last. When Daniel reached the table, he rested his hands on the back of the empty chair across from me and gave a quiet smile that felt more personal than any gesture he had made earlier that afternoon. He told me the train set was a wonderful gift and that he had not seen one like it in years. I simply nodded and said that I remembered how much he used to enjoy building tracks when he was young. Daniel let out a small laugh, the kind that comes when someone is surprised by a memory they had almost forgotten. He said he could still picture the old living room carpet covered with wooden tracks and little bridges, and he admitted that he had spent entire winter afternoons playing with it. We talked for a few minutes about those years, about how quickly time had passed and how strange it felt to see Ethan reaching the same age Daniel once was. The conversation was calm and comfortable, and for a moment the distance that had been growing between us all afternoon seemed to fade. But as Daniel stood there, glancing occasionally back toward the patio where Jessica continued speaking with guests, I could sense that something else was moving through his thoughts. It was not anger or frustration. It felt more like quiet realization. And in that moment I understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply remain patient long enough for the truth to reveal itself without raising their voice at all. Daniel remained beside my table a little longer than either of us probably expected, and the conversation between us continued in a quiet and natural way that felt strangely rare that afternoon. Around us the party still carried on with the cheerful sounds of children laughing and guests talking, but the moment felt calmer, almost separate from the busy energy near the patio. Daniel pulled out the chair across from me and finally sat down, resting his arms loosely on the table while watching Ethan across the yard. The boy had already begun lining up the wooden train tracks on the sidewalk with two other children kneeling beside him, all three of them carefully snapping the pieces together with the serious focus children often give to their favorite toys. Daniel smiled when he saw that and said softly that Ethan rarely sits still for anything that long. I told him that sometimes the simplest toys hold a child's attention the longest, especially when they remind them that imagination is more important than noise or flashing lights. Daniel nodded slowly as if considering the thought. After a moment he asked where I had found the train set, and I explained about the small toy shop downtown that still carried traditional wooden toys like the ones from years ago. He seemed genuinely interested and said that maybe he and Ethan should visit the store together one weekend. While we talked, several guests nearby began glancing toward our table with mild curiosity, perhaps surprised to see Daniel sitting away from the center of the party for the first time that afternoon. Jessica noticed it too. From across the patio I saw her pause briefly while speaking with a couple who had been admiring the decorations. Her eyes shifted toward our table, and although her expression remained pleasant for the guests, there was a brief tightening around her smile that only lasted a second before she resumed her conversation. Daniel did not appear to notice at first. He was still watching Ethan build the train track, occasionally laughing when the children argued about where the bridge piece should go. Eventually he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the yard in a more thoughtful way, as if seeing the arrangement of the party from a different perspective. He asked quietly whether I had been enjoying the afternoon. The question was simple, but the tone carried a hint of concern that had not been there earlier. I told him honestly that it had been nice to see Ethan so happy, and that the decorations looked beautiful. Daniel nodded again, though his eyes moved briefly toward the patio before returning to me. The moment felt delicate, like a conversation balanced carefully on the edge of something unspoken. Just then Ethan ran across the grass holding the red train engine in his hand and stopped beside our table with the kind of excitement only children carry. He asked Daniel if they could set up the entire track inside the living room later so it would not get stepped on outside. Daniel laughed and promised they would. Ethan then turned to me and gave me a quick hug before racing back to his friends. As Daniel watched his son run away again, he remained quiet for a few seconds, and I could almost see the realization forming in his mind. It was the kind that arrives slowly, not through arguments or accusations, but through small moments that begin to connect in ways that cannot easily be ignored. Daniel stayed seated beside me for a little while longer, quietly watching Ethan and the other children finish building the long line of wooden tracks along the edge of the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften, casting a warm golden light across the yard, while the voices of the guests blended into a gentle hum of conversation. From the patio Jessica continued speaking with a small group of parents, though every so often her eyes shifted toward our table as if she were trying to understand how the afternoon had slowly changed direction. Daniel finally stood and brushed his hands together lightly, the way people do when they are about to return to their responsibilities. He looked down at me with a thoughtful expression and said that he was glad I had come. The words were simple, but the tone carried a sincerity that had been missing earlier in the day. I told him that I would not have missed Ethan's birthday for anything. He smiled at that and nodded before walking back toward the patio, pausing briefly when Ethan called his name from across the lawn. The children had finished their train track and were proudly sending the small red engine around the curve they had built, cheering every time it rolled smoothly over the wooden bridge piece. Daniel crouched beside them again, helping adjust a section of track while listening to their excited instructions. I watched for a moment longer before slowly standing from my chair. The party was beginning to wind down as a few guests gathered their things and thanked Jessica for the afternoon. I picked up my purse and walked toward Ethan to say goodbye. When he saw me, he ran over immediately and wrapped his arms around me with the same easy affection he had shown all day. I told him I hoped he would have fun building many train tracks and that maybe next time I visited we could design an even bigger one together. He promised that we would and said he would keep the red engine safe until then. Daniel walked over while we spoke and rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder. For a moment the three of us stood there together in the fading sunlight, and something about the quiet simplicity of that moment felt more genuine than anything else that had happened during the entire party. Jessica approached a few seconds later, her expression composed but noticeably quieter than before. She thanked me for coming and said the gift had been very thoughtful. Her words were polite, yet there was a slight hesitation in them now, as if the afternoon had not unfolded exactly the way she had expected. I gave her a small nod and wished them all a good evening before heading toward the driveway. As I walked away, I could hear Ethan laughing again with his friends while Daniel called after him to be careful with the train tracks. When I reached my car, I paused for a moment and looked back at the house where the balloon still swayed gently above the patio. The afternoon had begun with a whisper that made me feel small, but it ended with something far more powerful than any argument. Sometimes the truth does not need to be shouted in front of a crowd. Sometimes it only needs patience, a quiet memory, and a small wooden train to remind people of where their story truly began.